without much stories, I think we can start now. I think more people will keep on coming in. So thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time. And over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Irene. So I've just pasted in the chat a link to the slides. For those of you who were here yesterday, I think most of you were, so thank you for coming back. We're going to be approaching this the same way, so we'll be collaborating in Google Slides. So I will share my screen. Have made sure that all of my messaging systems are off today, so we'll hope we don't have any extra Teams messages coming in. All right, so welcome to our second session on the hidden curriculum in EdTech. And our session today is focused specifically on architectures of control or hostile design. And on this first slide, the image that I follow an account on Twitter. Actually, I don't know if they're still on Twitter because I don't know if anyone's still on Twitter, but the account is Hostile Design. And they sort of just document examples of hostile design around the world. And in this picture, you'll see a brick wall with a sign that says danger, glass on wall, and lots of really jagged pieces of green and white or clear glass is on top of the wall. And we'll talk more specifically about what hostile design means, but this is sort of just an image to provoke you starting to think about what that might mean. So my access practices, you'll notice I'll try and do these throughout the session. So any relevant visuals in my slides will be described. I will read written contributions aloud to ensure they are accessible to everyone. So whether you're contributing in the slides, in the chat, or through comments, I'll try and read those aloud. Again, this isn't a very technical theoretical presentation, so I won't have a lot of disciplinary, technical, or jargony words. But when I do use terminology, I will explain it. And if I do use a term that you're not familiar with, or that my understanding seems to be different than yours, please ask, and then we can make sure that we are using the word in the same way. I invite you guys to participate however you're comfortable, so you can participate verbally. We're a small enough group, and I think it worked really well yesterday where people just sort of unmuted themselves or raised their hands, so however you're comfortable. If you'd prefer to participate in writing, I encourage you to do that either in the Zoom chat or within Google. You're welcome to participate silently. It's a very valid way to participate. So just to think about what we're talking about here and not actually engage either in writing or speaking or any other way that you're comfortable with. And finally, very open session. If you need to walk away for a bit, please do. If you need to leave early, please do. I guess it doesn't make sense for me to say if you need to come late, please do, because if you're already here, you're not late, but I will say it anyways. It's very, very fluid. For today's session, I also thought it was important for me to just make a quick statement of bias, particularly because of the topic we're going to talk about today. So in my work, both as a curriculum specialist, where I help kind of shape course designs and content designs, and as a PhD student, where I'm researching inclusive practices in higher education, my stance is a very critical stance. So I take a critical lens to how I engage in conversations around these topics, which means that all of my perspectives and responses to your guys' input and to questions are inclined to start from a critical space. And that means I'm always interested in conversations of power and control and power hierarchies and how systems and structures sort of replicate inequities. So my mind is always on trying to fix issues of control. My stance is evolving, but I recognize that not everyone here comes from that same perspective. So I do invite you guys to challenge me, to counter my points, to question my biases if you're working from another perspective, particularly when we're talking about hostile architectures and the harms they bring. Because as I keep being reminded when I have this conversation, sometimes these designs are intentional and serve a positive purpose. And I don't always jump to the happy places in these conversations. So I just wanted to put that out there. Please do challenge me if you're thinking, oh, you're too far that way. And it will make the conversation more interesting as well. All right, so before we begin, I think Irene has shared the slides. I think I did as well, but I will paste them one more time in the chat. And I did get a request in the chat to go to present mode so the slides are larger. The reason that I'm in this mode is to edit. I can't edit in present mode. So I don't know if I can make it any bigger in the view. But I'm hoping everyone will be able to open in their own browser, so you should be able to see it there.
That's okay. That's okay. I think everybody can open. If they can, then they can also say something. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we can find a solution. Probably I can present for you so that it's easier for you or something. We'll see. Thank you, though.
I think we do have a few people who didn't join us yesterday. So the way that the session that I'm trying to run this session is, instead of using a Jamboard or other collaborative tools, we'll actually be collaborating directly in the Google Slides, which means I've shared the link. Everyone should have edit permissions for the slides, and we're actually going to be working in this space together. So I don't want to make any assumptions that everyone is familiar with Google Slides. I know in the spaces where I work, most people have used Google Slides before, but I am going to do a quick orientation. For those of you who are really familiar with the tool or who saw the orientation yesterday, I invite you can take a moment to go grab a tea or coffee if it's not valuable for you to stay, but I will go quickly through how to use Google Slides. So the things that we're going to ask you to do today are editing the slides. And to edit on the slides, you should be able to add elements. So we'll mostly be using these little speech bubbles. To edit, you would double click on the speech bubble. You'll see a flashing line, and then you can start adding text. Because there are multiple people, so it looks like we currently have 9 people sharing the slides. One thing that might pop up is that you might end up conflicting with other people trying to edit the same thing. In the slides, if somebody else is editing an element, it should pop up with an outline and it will tell you that another user is editing it. So this speech bubble is now highlighted in red and it says anonymous pumpkin. So in another browser, I am an anonymous pumpkin. I'm editing the speech bubble. So if that is the case, you'll want to choose a different speech bubble or a different element to edit. We will also be using comments. So to add a comment, towards the top right, you should see a speech bubble or icon that says open comment history, and then a speech bubble with a plus. So you can use this to add a comment. There will be opportunities where instead of adding text, I'll invite you to choose images instead. So to add an image along the top menu, you would choose insert, insert image. And there are a couple of different options from where you can get your images. I tend towards search the web, which brings you to Google image search. Since we're talking about hostile architecture, let's see what they have for us. And then you can just drag and drop your image into it. Most likely you'll need to resize. It likes to bring in really big images. So you'll just click one of the boxes around it to resize. And then the only other thing we'll be doing is in one of the activities, we'll just be moving some things around. So to move an object around on a slide, you would just click on it. It should be outlined in blue, and then you can just drag and drop it to wherever you want. So hopefully, if anyone is not familiar with Google, that gives you enough of a grounding to participate. If you do run into any issues and Google Slides just isn't working for you, again, you're welcome to participate in the Google chat or out loud, or just message one of us and we can help make sure that you have the tools that you need to participate. All right. So we're going to have our first experiment with participating. Again, those of you who were here yesterday, you should be familiar with this activity. Everyone here is now a collaborator and a co-author on these slides. We'll be kind of creating them together. So to start, I'm going to ask everyone to add your name to either slide 6 or slide 7 and tell us why you're here. Why are you here to talk about More broadly, the hidden curriculum in EdTech, and more specifically, hostile design or architectures of control. So I see in the messages, a lot of people were here yesterday. So again, thank you guys all for coming back. And we have a lot of people who want to continue on the conversation around the hidden curriculum, specifically about hostile designs. Danielle mentions that this topic is not discussed enough, and I agree. We just don't really talk about the design of the tool so much as how we use it. So I think that's very true. Meg writes, I think hostile design is part of the culture of my institution, and I want to try and shift the culture. That's very true as well. And I will say, although our session is going to sort of focus on hostile design in technologies, the concept can be applied more broadly to all of those elements of the hidden curriculum that we were talking about yesterday, and that we'll revisit later on today. Virginia says she wants to learn and discuss more about EdTech, and Virginia, you made so many great contributions yesterday. So again, I invite you to do the same today if your head is in space to do so. Bridget from Los Angeles said she enjoyed the session last time and she's here to get a more systemic perspective on open ed. And we will talk about sort of openness and closeness as elements of hostility in design. We don't go into that a lot. That might be like an option for a future session if the conversation inspires us that way. And Shahina says that they attended yesterday's session and would like to know the hostile design to avoid it. And avoidance, as I said before, in my kind of critical perspective, avoidance is an immediate guttural reaction, but we'll also talk about where it might be appropriate. So I'm flipping to slide 7. So Ty, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anyone's names. I invite you to correct me. But Ty says, I have been thinking about applying the concept of hostile architecture to pedagogy, so this seemed like a good place to come. Great. I'd love to hear more about how you've been thinking about applying it. It's definitely an interesting conversation starter, so happy to chat about it. And then Irene says that she learned a lot in the hidden curriculum yesterday, so she came back. Thank you for coming back, Irene, and for starting us off with the great music. So on slide 8, I actually have borrowed some of what you guys said yesterday about the hidden curriculum. So we're not gonna do a lot of time revisiting those activities, but we did such a great job yesterday that I just want to bring those ideas forward. So the first question is, what is the hidden curriculum? And yesterday, one of our participants, Sierra, said, unconscious bias, reasons and rules that we might not even be aware of, that we bring to the classroom and end up transmitting to our students. So it's these, again, hidden, invisible, these structures in our classrooms that end up being part of what we're teaching students. Somebody yesterday, there was no name, so I just called them the anonymous panda, said things that affect learning, cognitive, affective, that aren't explicitly stated as intended outcomes. They may actually be hidden agenda, or maybe no one meant for them to happen. And the reason I really liked this is because it talks sort of about intention. Sometimes, and a part of the conversation yesterday was about how sometimes we intend to hide learning, knowledge, outcomes in our designs. So they're intended to be hidden. And sometimes they just sort of happen because of all these things that are exerting influence over how we teach. And so it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because sometimes there's malice, sometimes there's intention, sometimes there's good intention. It's not always incidental to our learning environments. And then finally, Danielle, who has returned today, thank you for coming back, Danielle, wrote, the hidden curriculum is maybe institutional material or culture that impacts the design of a course. Without this impact, the ideal is that the learning objectives in students and teachers shape the learning. And the reason that I really liked this is because when we think about the curriculum, we think about this contained space that is our content, our tools, our students, and our teachers. And we think that's what makes up the curriculum. That's what happens in the classroom. That's what shapes learning experiences. But that doesn't take into account all of those other influences at all layers of the institution. So I thought it was really interesting that we think about the ideal as learning objectives, students, and teachers, but there's so much more, and we need to be aware of that. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone else wants to either expand on any of these, because I know some of these authors are with us, or provide other perspectives on what they think the hidden curriculum is. And again, I invite you to unmute or to use the chat, however you're comfortable. And for those of you who were not with us yesterday, in the slides, in the notes, there is the link to yesterday's slides. I will also paste these in the chat, so you can see all of the other ideas that came up. It seems like nobody wants to. Oh, and Virginia writes, there's also an element of epistemology and hegemony. We had debated pronunciation of this word yesterday in the hidden curriculum. Absolutely, Virginia. A lot of my work is about disciplining, like working with different disciplines, different professions, and navigating those sort of epistemologies that are in the signature pedagogies for each discipline. So I work with people who come from an anthropology background, who think about knowledge and learning very differently than somebody who's a clinical practitioner. And that's a really important part of it, because our epistemologies, the way we think about what knowledge is and what learning is, definitely shapes how we approach teaching. All right. So another summary from our discussion yesterday, slide 9 talks about where does the hidden curriculum exist? And we talked about physical spaces. So the way that our classrooms are designed, the way that our buildings are designed, the way that our campuses are designed. We talked about digital spaces, so our ed tech tools, and where we house learning online. We talked about policies across the institution, so course, departmental, institutional policies. We talked specifically about course content and representation in course content. A lot of my work is around this, specifically imagery. So who's visible in our actual pictures in our course content, or language? How do we talk about different people, different concepts, different things, and what language do we use? In the resources, so whose voices are on our reading lists and whose voices are not. All of these are part of the hidden curriculum because they tell us where, what is valued and who is valued. The methods of communication. So how are we communicating with our students? How do we invite them to communicate with us? How do we create opportunities for them to communicate with each other? Deadlines and schedules. So this was a big, I think a few people mentioned this yesterday. It was just how strictly do we structure deadlines? How do we stack them, and who might those not advantage or advantage? A big source, and quite often one of the main topics when we talk about hidden curriculum, is assessment. So what are we assessing? How are we assessing it? How are we grading it? And that for a lot of students sort of defines what's worth learning. If it's not being assessed, we're sort of implicitly teaching students it's not worth learning. Definitions of success came up as well. So what does it actually mean to succeed? And are the students' definitions the same as the instructors' definitions, the same as the institutional definitions, and so on? So the conclusion, and I will posit that the hidden curriculum exists everywhere. Every single element, every single factor in our teaching, in our learning environments, in our educational spaces, has hidden agendas, hidden values, hidden ideologies that in some way will impact teaching. And then in the chat, Virginia has added that language includes jargon and organization of ideas. And jargon especially, when you talk about accessibility or when you talk about universal design, in academia, jargon, disciplinary, very specific disciplinary language is actually a gatekeeping tool. When we use these really complex language structures and terms, we're keeping people out. And that says something as well. There is hidden curriculum there where if you don't understand the language that I'm using, I'm telling you, you're not really invited into this space. So absolutely, Virginia. Way back when, my master's was in applied linguistics and was a lot about this, about how we use language to form relationships or to create social distance. So it's a very interesting topic as well. And then Danielle, do you want to talk about the plain language concept?
Yeah, it's something that has arisen. Well, I see it a lot in government that it has arisen, because when you're told to go to a certain government page, or you're given a government form or some kind of guide from the government, and it's really difficult to read. Well, the Canadian government, the American government, and probably many other around the world are evolving towards plain language. And so it's to replace complex wording with something that the average person can read, because I think there is increased acknowledgement that the reading level across the world, whether you're from a place where literacy is claimed to be high or not, generally people's reading levels are far lower than we might think, or far lower than are definitely needed to read these documents produced in the government. So the plain language concept is increasing. On the government, Canadian government sites, there's whole documents related to how to write better in terms of plain language. And so what it does is it improves your writing, it increases the accuracy of it, but it also increases the readability of it. And this is stuff that you can, I watched several webinars on this topic. I've got several books on it now, and you can learn about it superficially, and that's a start. And then once you start to learn more about it, then you realize, okay, there's a great depth to what we're doing here. And so, yeah, so it talks about a lot of things, but generally what it is to increase accessibility so that, you don't misinterpret something that and then act in a way that's actually illegal when you intended to do the right thing.
If you have any of those resources that you would recommend and don't mind sticking them in the chat, I'd be interested to see sort of what you've been doing, because I know that like in my spaces we talk about knowledge translation a lot, so translating for different audiences, which is a bit plain language, but what you're talking about sounds like it's much more in-depth and useful. A sort of a related but interesting story. My partner comes from an ancient history background, and he used to talk about law, and how in ancient Greece, in the courthouse, they would have all the laws written out on the courthouse walls in plain English, so that every citizen would understand the laws, be able to enact and enforce the laws. And the profession of law has moved so far away from that the language they now use in laws is so dense and difficult that you need professionals. And it's sort of that same idea of gatekeeping, where before language was written in such a way that everyone could understand the concepts. And that's no longer the case. So it's nice to see that government is sort of going back that way. And Virginia writes, there are some laws in the US, federal and state, that require plain language. And rhetoric style is more direct with simple sentences, subject, verb, others. And thank you for sharing that resource, Danielle. Okay, so as we can see, that the hidden curriculum itself is complex because it does exist everywhere. But what we are kind of interested in here is, what does it do? So all of these little pieces of what shapes learning experiences, what do they actually do? How do they impact what happens in the classroom? And we talked about this a bit yesterday as well. So our summary is that the hidden curriculum exerts an influence over how teachers teach. So it changes their pedagogies, their practices, the way they craft learning experiences or their course websites or the curriculum. And it impacts how learners learn. It impacts how relationships are formed. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is power dynamics, relationships of control, especially when we're talking about hostile design. It impacts what knowledge and skills are valued. So what's on the syllabus tells students this is important. And then we have what's not on the syllabus tells students this isn't important. As one example, what we assess tells students what's valued. And then it also tells students, the instructor, institutions, who is valued and welcomed in educational spaces. So the hidden curriculum is very much tied, again, to that sort of critical lens on who are these spaces designed for? Who do we make it easy to participate? Who do we create participation challenges for? And all of that is wrapped up in this hidden curriculum. All right. So as promised, today we are taking a critical lens. We're going to look at power and control. So moving on to slides 11 and 12, and I invite you to join me on whichever one you choose, they're the same slide, to answer the question, what relationship exists between the hidden curriculum and control and power? So we talked about this a little bit, but I just want your ideas. What do you think is that relationship between the hidden curriculum and control and power? And again, to edit, you would just choose any of these little speech bubbles, double click, and you should be able to start typing text. And we're on slides 11 and 12. just want to say it's fascinating watching ideas unfold in the slides. I'm hoping nobody's feeling like super surveilled. All right, I can see some people are still typing, but I'm going to start talking through some of these. So our first thought says the hidden curriculum often maintains power structures and reinforces system bias. Absolutely. So a lot of what the hidden curriculum does is we've built these structures, or somebody built these structures to maintain power for a very specific group of people. And these structures continue to reinforce that status quo. And until we reveal that the hidden curriculum exists and that it's doing this work of maintaining the status quo of reinforcing inequities, we can't fix it. So that's a very powerful and succinct reason about why we need to talk about the hidden curriculum and control and power. Danielle writes, instructors who have a sense of entitlement or hierarchy will consciously or not teach and design their course and syllabus in ways that are unnecessarily controlling and possibly harmful. Students with these attitudes can harm the learning environment too. Yeah. So a lot of the hidden curriculum, and especially when we get to specifically architectures of control, is about who controls that space, who has the power in the space. And part of it goes back to what Virginia was saying about epistemologies, but also about what we think about learning. So if we have a model of learning where the instructor is the expert, the instructor holds all the power because they hold all the knowledge, and students are the recipients, those spaces will be designed in a different way, and the power dynamics of those spaces will be quite different. And I agree, I think it's important to observe that students absolutely can contribute to relationships of control and power, depending on how they position themselves in the classroom as well. One of our contributors writes, in Africa, learners are taught in either English, French, and in some cases in South Africa and Afrikaans, and younger learners are punished for not speaking fluently. So language itself, and actually just based on our conversation, I've written that I need to look into more about language as hostile architecture. But language is absolutely a control mechanism. And we talk about this a lot. I lived in Scotland for a few years, and they started to try and bring back in Scots Gaelic into the education, but it was taken out and in an attempt to sort of erase that culture and express or have dominance in English be dominant in those cultures. And I'm sure there are many, many examples of this around the world. I'll pop back because I see some people are still editing. I don't want to read before their thoughts are complete. So on slide 12, Virginia writes, whoever has the power decides on the rules of learning, control over epistemology, content, learning methodology, and that the hidden curriculum encompasses. The power may be inside or outside the classroom. This affects students' sense of ownership. Absolutely. So the idea of rules, who dictates what we're actually doing in the classroom and why we're doing it. And then the student sense of ownership. Virginia, do you want to speak to that last concept? Because I think that's really important, and I don't want to misrepresent what you mean by it.
Yes, so actually this was in my dissertation, this was a point, not just student agency, but also the sense of ownership, that the more that the greater the distance from what I called negotiated knowledge. If you have, for example, an institution that forces a certain format, and the students have very little, or people who are working within it have very little agency, then their perception is, this is not my knowledge. This is the institution's knowledge. So or this is not my knowledge, this is society's knowledge because they're making me learn this. So the greater the distance is from the actual, the amount of agency that they have, the greater the distance that the people are from them who have the power, the less likely they are to take ownership of that knowledge. It's not theirs, it's someone else's, but they need to have it. So then it's used more in a transactional manner rather than them actually embracing that knowledge as their own.
What that immediately is starting to make me think of as well, and this is not a space where I have a lot of learning to do, but our institution is starting to work on decolonizing curriculum and decolonizing like courses. And part of it is that we do privilege in Western institutions. We privilege scientific knowledge in a way, so like positivist knowledge. And so students who don't see their own ways of knowing or understanding may also experience sort of what you're talking about. So that's what it immediately makes me think of. So thank you for sharing.
Exactly. That's what it is. It's not theirs, but they know they have to know it in order to succeed, however that is, in their society. So they know that, but then alongside that, they have their own understanding that they maintain, that's their knowledge. So they have knowledge that's available to those who need it. That's not necessarily their knowledge, but someone else's, but they have access to it. Or they have created their own understanding of the knowledge that is their own, that they can withhold from anyone because they may not see that as valued, or they may keep it for their own communities because they know that in those communities it's actually valued.
I'm just sharing a resource in the chat. I am not sure if people are familiar with it, and I'm not going to go too far down into it, but there's this concept called two-eyed seeing, which comes from a Mi'kmaq elder, which is being able to create space and curriculum for people to see the world both through these dominant, arguably necessary paradigms of knowing in order to meet the requirements, or the hidden curriculum, I guess, but meet the requirements of education and to act in society, but also simultaneously teaching them in a way that recognizes their own ways of knowing. Really, really interesting work. I'm not an expert on it, but I just shared the resource if anyone wants to read more about it. Okay, so our next contributor writes, hidden curriculum helps those empowered keep their power. Absolutely. Again, a lot of what the hidden curriculum does is just reinforcing established structures of dominance and equality or inequity in society. I'm going to quickly pop back to our first slide. Yazir writes, those who will consider accessibility and inclusion will invoke it on the classroom level, even if it appears as a hidden curriculum and not mentioned in the syllabus. Yeah, so absolutely. So first, I like this because, again, I take the critical stance. Hidden curriculum is bad, and it's important to recognize that elements of it are good. Where when we model certain ways of acting in the classroom, even if we're not explicit about it, it does help the culture as a whole learn about certain ways of doing things. And accessibility is a big one of those, where I've worked with a lot of instructors who talk about accessibility, but they don't practice it necessarily. And it's that practice is where we're actually saying this is important. And then learners in Africa are praised for speaking good English, and sometimes it comes with rewards, promotions, and scholarships. This is very interesting to me. I used to teach English for academic purposes, and part of our programming was very problematic because it was accent reduction. I'm not sure who contributed this, but does somebody want to speak more to this?
Oh,
Irene, please.
So I like there's a comment in the previous that says those with power try to keep the power. And I think the one thing that we have been kept under is the language that we speak, because we are, like, for example, I started learning in English when I was very young, and Kiswahili or Swahili came as a second language, you know, or you are taught like a subject, not even the one that you speak, as much as it's a national language. So I'm just thinking that we are kept there. We are kept there, and we laugh at each other when we don't speak very good English, actually, in Africa. we tend to think, you know, because of the way we've been socialized, and I think that is, I think the people who want to keep us under there have quite succeeded, because even the other day, I think one of the languages in Nigeria was being recognized, but the people who are presented in English. They didn't speak in Yoruba. So you see where I'm coming from. So I think we need to get out of that, where we get out of that control and power that the other languages have over us. But then we cannot get good education or even promotions in workplaces if you're interviewed and you can't speak proper English. You know, you've been interviewed in English, and they'll tell you, oh, well, come back, or we'll call you, don't call us. And later you realize that because either your dictions or the way you speak was not good enough, then that's why you didn't get the job. And by the way, this is a job that only requires you to do with your hands. You know, some of us are good with our hands, and some of us are good in doing. They're not good in reading. They're not good in speaking. So yeah, so I'm very passionate about it. I'm sure you can hear it from my tone. But thank you. Back to you, Dan.
No, and I think it's a really important point, because a lot of what you're saying is about the biases, the assumptions that we make about people if they can't speak, and you said in quotes, good English. And it is definitely a social issue. My partner comes from the UK, where they have different accents, and there's a hierarchy associated with each accent. And it's not the same. I recognize this, but people from certain areas have very thick regional accents, and there have been lots of studies saying they're less likely to get jobs because they sound uneducated, or they sound unintelligent, or whatever it is. So like accent discrimination, language discrimination is a huge part of the hidden curriculum, but also just like society in general, big problematic structures in society. And I see Virginia sort of adds to that. She writes, learning in a colonizing language limits knowledge and ways of knowing. The concepts of time, for example, will be different from language to language. I love socio and anthrolinguists. Yeah, so that's the other thing, is that we lose a lot of language, or a lot of knowledge and ways of thinking about the world, when we force everything into English. I'm gonna pause there though, because I feel like we could do an entire session just talking about language, and I'd love to. But we're going to talk about hostile architecture. So I'm going to move on, but thank you so much for sharing, Irene. This has been a really great chat. Okay, so going back to the idea of control, and we're going to move into the topic of hostile architectures, or architectures of control. And the underlying kind of premise of this entire session is that control of space is linked with control of social behavior. So whoever controls the space, whether it's physical space or digital space, can control how people are able to act and engage and behave within that space. And here I have an image, which I think is actually really, really helpful for this conversation. So it's a grassy boulevard between a sidewalk and a road. And on the boulevard, in the grass, there's a sign sticking up that says no camping. And the sign sets a rule. But in addition to the sign, there are tons of large and medium-sized jagged boulders spread across the grass, basically making it impossible for anyone to pitch a tent. So there are two things happening here. One is a rule has been established. We're saying don't camp here. Two, the space has been controlled in such a way that regardless of the sign, nobody would be able to camp there. And we will return to this image. But it sort of sets it's supposed to sort of set our understanding of what the hostile architecture is. Before we return to it, I'm going to ask everyone to join me on slide 14, where we're going to talk about control. So in our teaching practices, there is this spectrum of control, how much control you exert as an instructor over your physical space, over your digital space, over the curriculum. And it ranges from total control, which means that you dictate absolutely everything that happens. When students start, when they end, what assignments they do, what they read, how they read, you monitor everything. And on the total other end of the spectrum is complete flexibility. You, in this world, you have chosen nothing. You're like, read what you want, do what you want. The world is your oyster. Everything is up to you. And obviously neither of these extremes is really ideal or practical or probably implementable. But between the two, everyone is going to fall sort of more towards total control, more towards complete flexibility, or possibly right in the middle. So this is where we're going to do that drag and drop. Along the bottom, there are all these little polka dots. I'm going to ask you to choose one and drag it to where you think your teaching practice falls. So for me, I lean more, probably not surprising, I lean more towards flexibility, giving students choice in what topics they're learning, how they engage in learning and whatnot. But you may not, and it is anonymous, so you can just, wherever you think you fall, place your dot. Great. So we see a lot of people kind of more towards the flexible end of the spectrum, and then a dot that's a little bit just left of center towards control, and somebody's dead center. Interesting. All right. So the point of this activity is just so you can start thinking about the next part of the conversation on what control mechanisms are you actually using and what do they do? So our next question, we're actually going to start talking about our topic only halfway through the workshop. On slides 15 and 16, before I jump into explaining hostile design from how I understand it, I'm going to ask you, what comes to mind when you hear hostile architecture or hostile design? What does that mean to you? So maybe you've read about it, maybe you've seen it, maybe you have a lot of experience, please draw on that. If it's something you've never heard the term before, just explain like what do you immediately think it might be? And there are spots both on slides 15 and 16, so they're the same canvas. Like typing has paused, so I'm going to go over some of these. I'm going to start in the bottom right. It says using the built environment to control or restrict behavior. For example, the learning management system controlling how instructors grade students. Yes, so absolutely. And this is, when we talk about hostile design and ed tech, this is a big part of it, is what do our technologies allow us to do? And then what are we going to do because of that? And quite often, I work at an institution where our learning management system is quite outdated. And I quite often have to coach faculty through changing their practice because the learning management system won't let them do a thing they want to. So that's a great example. Virginia writes, doesn't take the student or teacher into consideration, gives little agency over learning except through the instructional design. So this is really interesting to me because hostile architectures or hostile designs happen before people, well, before your users get involved. So a lot of it is stuff that's pre-built, which means that there is no agency because all of the design happened before your actors, your participants are really involved. Virginia, did you want to add anything to that? I feel like maybe my interpretation might not exactly be what you were going for.
Now that's what it is exactly, that that it doesn't take into consideration and whoever is doing the instructional design, it can be institutional, it could be the instructor themselves. That's why I have teacher in parentheses, or it could also be like an LMS, which or these publishing companies now that have that will do the course for you. And as a teacher, you have very little control over it, and your students have very little control over it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, is when we talk about hostile design, often we think about it as something against students, but I think just as likely it could be against teachers too and shaping their practice. And then somebody writes, not taking into consideration students' unforeseen situations. Very much so. Hostile architectures by design are inflexible. They don't allow for, even if the behavior that you're trying to control is one that you don't want students to engage in, for example, submitting an assignment late, there are always circumstances where you might need more flexibility, and by design, hostile architectures or architectures of control don't allow for that flexibility. I see slide 16. Somebody has created a beautiful set of images. Bridget, was this your slide? Do you want to speak to it?
Sure. So yeah, as we were talking, I was putting some of the terms in Midjourney to see what would come to, what it would come up with, and they were diverse, but definitely some interesting things to think about. Yeah, I think these were the ones that stood out to me, like things that are overwhelming, the sort of monster that is kind of invites us to consider how we make the student feel. But then I like the vertical building that seems very complicated. If you want to get to some place on the top, how are you supposed to get there? It's quite a maze, a puzzle. And this, being overwhelmed with books or being, directed into a technology. Yeah, it came up with some interesting perspectives.
So
curious if anyone else has interpretation.
The first image, like the mountain of books that sort of are haphazardly piled behind the student. I don't know why, but it's a positive vibe. I don't know why. But that's really interesting. And then in the middle, your second image, the house that's sort of like bits and pieces tacked on. It looks like an engineer's nightmare. It reminds me of the Howl's Moving Castle. I'm not sure if anyone's a Miyazaki fan, but it's like a very lopsided house with lots of bits put on. Very interesting.
I'll have to look that up.
And then let's go to slide 17. Control, inflexibility, rigid, uncaring. Yeah, so a lot of negativity here, which is again how I approached the topic, and I think the word hostile brings that out. But yeah, so inflexibility, rigid, uncaring, they're not places that are welcoming. And then Danielle writes, passive aggressive instructors are hostile. So are those who yell at or humiliate students, especially when students make a reasonable mistake. So this is really interesting because hostility, I think, does mean this. How does this, Danielle, I'll invite you to speak, or you can decline, but how would you see this sort of passive aggressivity being enacted in our ed tech, so our technologies?
I guess I can go back to the example you presented yesterday, the one with the deadlines that were busted by all the students, because that could have been designed with the best intentions or the worst intentions. So with the worst intentions, it would be a prof who says, this is your deadline, but you also have a chance to do a revision. And then okay, the students meet the deadline, but they do a revision, and then in the system it's indicated as late. Oh, it's indicated as late, you get points docked off. But I guess a better example would be one that I heard of that shows the problems of Turnitin. So what happened was, in this one class, there were, I don't know how many students, let's say 100 students, and the professor said you all need to write I don't know, like a 200-word essay or something like that, like something very short. And her instructions were very, very limiting. Like, you have to talk about this theme and this theme and this theme, and you have to cite this author and this author, and you have to talk about this thing and this thing. And so, unsurprisingly, a lot of the students produced material that was very similar within the classroom, though I'm guessing most of them probably worked in a very ethical and in a very ethical way, using academic integrity and all of that. So when the students put their work through Turnitin as required by the prof, oh, surprise, surprise, there was a lot of how do you say, the indicate, it looked like they copied off of each other, but the result was unexpected, given that she had such tight constraints, and so she didn't understand how she was being hostile with Turnitin.
It also sounds like that assignment would be perfect assignment for AI to do for you. Like a really good reason why like our assignment designs need to be more flexible. All right, so let's actually talk about hostile design. On slide 18, I have a number of pictures, and the concept of hostile design comes from urban architecture and how physical spaces are built. And it's specifically that hostile designs are built to prevent what are deemed undesirable social behaviors. So we're preventing certain people from acting in certain ways in our physical spaces. And there's lots and lots of different ways that hostile designs are built into physical spaces. So here I've provided a couple of common ones. So first, seating, and in a lot of these examples, they're considered anti-homelessness designs. So they're wanting people who are experiencing homelessness to not really use these spaces. So in terms of seating, a lot of benches, and I always find this fascinating because then as soon as you go outside, you'll start noticing this in places you didn't before. This is a bench that has lots of metal armrests kind of put throughout, but essentially what it means is that nobody can lay down or sleep on these benches. So they're deliberately designed to prevent people from laying down on them. Another site of hostile designs in physical spaces are just other surfaces, again, preventing people from loitering, from laying down, from sort of settling in. So this is a picture of a train station, I believe in Stockholm, where there is a raised surface and it just has a bunch of random triangular shaped metal prongs around the surface to prevent anyone from sitting on that surface. Some hostile designs are also anti-drug use behavior. So lighting in bathrooms in places where people who are drug users would go to use drugs. They have started putting in blue lighting. What this does is it makes it actually harder to see your veins in your skin. So it's a hostile design to prevent intravenous drug use in these spaces. Another very common example of hostile design are barriers. So fences, walls, anything to prevent people from coming in or going out. And so the picture here is just of a metal fence with barbed wire at the top, which would prevent people from climbing over the fence. Surveillance, also a type of hostile design. It's actually a really interesting one because in and of itself, the camera doesn't prevent you from doing a thing. I could commit a crime in front of the camera, but it exerts a psychological influence over people thinking, oh, I'm being watched, so I'm not going to do behaviors that I don't want other people to see. And this is actually really, really applicable to when we talk about ed tech and digital spaces, because a lot of our surveillance mechanisms are more fear, like fear mongering, making students afraid to do something like Danielle was just talking about with Turnitin. And then finally, ghost amenities. So here you see a subway station platform with a couple of people there. But I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to take a guess on what ghost amenities means with regards to hostile design.
I'm thinking maybe that it would appear that there is something there like bathrooms or something, and there isn't.
I do believe this is the yellow part is for the people not to go beyond it. It should be before the yellow. They should stand before the yellow or below the yellow line here because of the train.
So on the platform, there is a thick yellow line sort of right at the edge of the platform. This isn't hostile design because it doesn't actually prevent someone from standing there. This is more like the sign that said no camping. So it's saying don't stand here, but if somebody wanted to stand there, they still could. And then sort of what I think it was Virginia who spoke before you. The bathrooms, ghost amenities are the absence of certain things in spaces. So for example, the absence of bathrooms in public parks prevents certain people from using public parks. In this image, it's a subway, and the thing that's very clearly missing from the subway platform are benches. There's nowhere to sit here. So that's a ghost amenity where we are not providing people with a certain thing that they might need in this space to prevent those people, whoever those people may be, from using the space. And ghost amenities is another really interesting thing to think about when we think about digital spaces. So it ties in a lot with accessibility, the things that we aren't doing in our practices that tell certain people you don't belong here. And I've realized that I've not kept up with the chat. So I apologize. I'm just going to look at the last couple. So rigid rights that Turnitin is a great example of hostile design. Students don't have a choice to not accept terms of service if they want credit. It also assumes the worst about their motives. In Turnitin, it would be a really good example of a surveillance hostile design because it does make students feel watched and it forces them to sort of do things in a certain way. And then Danielle writes, the absence of benches is harming people with disabilities or who are pregnant. Yeah, or elderly people or people who've been traveling. There's a lot of people who benefit from benches and spaces that the hostile design is targeting the specific behavior that they might not want there. Most likely, again, anti-homelessness design, but there are a lot of people who are impacted negatively by it. Okay. So now that we've talked about physical design and I've given a couple of examples, this is meant to be about ed tech. We haven't really talked that much about ed tech yet. So slides 19 and 20, I'm going to ask you now, thinking about some of these examples of hostile design, where do you see or what examples of hostile architecture exist in the digital spaces where you work or teach or play or use? So think about hostile design now in digital space. On slide 19, there are speech bubbles if you want to participate with text. I've also put slide 20 in with a blank canvas if you wanted to add images. So if you had screenshots or you just wanted to add Google images, you can choose how you want to respond to this. I'm gonna start with some of them at the bottom. Tools and spaces that are not inclusive. And then Danielle similarly writes that there are features in many LMSs or learning management systems that are not accessible. For example, some flip cards flip too fast for a screen reader to read them properly. So inaccessible design is a very clear example of hostile architecture, where we're saying that students with disabilities are not, these spaces are not designed for them. So we're in creating inaccessible spaces, we're saying who is and is not welcome in those spaces. And that's a really, really good example of hostile architecture. Often it's unintentional hostile architecture where people just don't know better, but that's not an excuse. And it's something that a lot of institutions need to work on. And I'd say in physical spaces, it's just as problematic. Paywalls, I really like because it actually, like when we were looking earlier, we had the barriers. Paywalls are a very clear barrier to accessing information and to knowledge equity. So paywalls is a great example of hostile architecture. We're saying only people who either have institutional access or somehow another way are privileged either monetarily are able to access this information. Scantron machines. I may ask whoever put this here to explain it because I can't immediately the hostility there.
Sorry, I guess, so it's not in the digital space either really, but I was thinking about how just the investment in multiple choice testing at every level in universities, from their having these machines to having just courses, the ways courses are graded. This reliance on the multiple choice form is, you know, hostile to many different parts of various students' learning styles, and also kind of hostile specifically to the relationship between the teacher and the student. Like I'm thinking about the way a Scantron machine gets between a teacher and a student. And I think even though that's maybe a not digital experience, it's there's a lot of digital experiences in ed tech that are being designed in a similar way that get between the student and the teacher, I mean.
Yeah, actually, I really like that phrasing, like the hostile architectures that get between the teacher and the student. And I think assessment more broadly of that, I think specifically about Scantron machines, but that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing, Bridget. And then I guess we see assessment appearing in some of these other responses. So in the LMS grade books, linear progression of topics. So for those of you who attended yesterday, we talked about designs that force students to complete task A before they can engage with content, the second set of content. And that would be considered a form of hostile architecture because you're forcing students to go through content in a specific order. Limited or difficult customization. OER software, prioritize text, limited characters for alt text, limited options for interaction. The limited characters for alt text is very, very frustrating because it limits our ability to engage in accessible practice. Absolutely. QR codes in online workshops assume you can use multiple devices. And I think another one above says the use of mobiles within lecturing. So there is, in some of our designs, there is an assumption that students have certain access to technology, which not all students do. So again, we're advantaging students who have more technology available to them. Probably students from certain socioeconomic backgrounds or certain students who grew up in more technological spaces. So I find that really interesting too. And then non-responsive designs, we did talk about accessibility. And then Virginia writes templates that don't allow spatial access to course design. Virginia, could you explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, I didn't really explain that. That doesn't sound good, but our LMS has certain templates that we are expected to use, and it's very linear. And so your course design has to be linear. You're not allowed to have something that's more spatial where you could have students go back and forth between different modules and elements.
Okay, and what that also says to me is that students don't get a choice. So every student engages in every topic, and as opposed to what we were sort of talking about earlier, where some students may be able to have more flexibility. So they only do topics 1, 4, and 5, which sounds like your digital space wouldn't allow for that.
But also it doesn't allow the teacher to change what they're doing. So I teach communication and I have a project that goes the whole, the same project that they work on throughout the entire semester. But then it's broken up into smaller groups, into smaller chunks. And there's no way that it's very complicated for me to make it accessible online for my students to figure out how to do that. A lot of them get confused because how do they access this project that is there the entire time? Unless I have the project and I have the little bit, but then they can't see their progress on the project itself. So having simultaneous modules that are open, it doesn't allow me to do that.
Are you forced to use this tool at your institution?
Yes. Yes, because they want it to be standard so that every course, the students, because students, they said that students complained that each place is, each course was different. So therefore they were having trouble following the courses. So they decided to make them all linear.
I think you've just highlighted another really important way that hostile architecture functions, which is homogenizing. It's forcing every teacher to teach the same way, every student to learn the same way. So it both assumes that there is a normal student that this way works for, but also like every subject shouldn't be taught in exactly the same fashion. So it's very interesting to me, the example that you just gave, because it really is saying like our tools, our architectures, the way that they're designed is forcing everything to be the same. Thank you for showing that example. One thing I'm really loving about these sessions is my plethora of Post-it notes where I have all these things I want to look at more. So thank you guys for sharing all these brilliant insights. I'm just going to go through the rest of the things you've written here, Virginia, because I think they're important as well. So limits to who can access tools or software, or who has the permissions to edit tools or software. Zoom's actually a really great example of this, in that the host in Zoom can do a lot more in that space. And then participants are very limited in how they can engage. So I think that's really interesting too. In the learning management system, who can edit the content, who can organize it. Absolutely. Limits on how you are identified in this space. Last name, first name, legal name only. Also, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, how some tools, when you have to select demographic data, they force a binary understanding of gender on you. So they're forcing you to identify within this understanding of gender. And that is absolutely a hostile architecture, because it's forcing people to either misidentify or telling them they don't belong in those spaces. And then timestamps, devise interaction software. I'm not sure I understand this one, Virginia.
Okay, so for example, if you upload something, so I'm located in New York, in Albany, New York. If I have a student that's located in China, then when they go to upload something, the timestamp is New York time. So if I say that it's midnight time, or midnight that something is due, they upload it on midnight their time. It comes out as late. So there's no, it's wherever the instructor is, that's what the timestamp is. And then in terms of device interaction, that would be, or the software, it assumes that they are either on a laptop or a computer. Whereas a lot of my students use tablets or phones. And so when they download something, they have to actually download an app, and that app doesn't have all the functions that the laptop has, the program that's the web-based program. So there's that, and then there's also ours. Our university is a Microsoft university. So therefore, if you have something that is from Apple or Mac, then, and even sometimes Androids, but not as much, you have trouble uploading assignments, for example, because it's all based on Microsoft.
The platform issue, I think, is a really interesting one too, because some platforms like Apple products are traditionally more expensive. So they also are tied to sort of what students can afford or not afford. But by forcing all users to use a certain platform, there is definitely a hidden curriculum there for sure. But that is, I would say, a hostile design. I agree. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we had one person contribute a picture, which I think I can interpret, but I just wonder if the person who contributed it might want to speak to it. And it's a picture of a yellow triangle person at the beginning of a maze, and at the end of the maze, there's a yellow sign that says finish.
I would be happy to. This for a couple of reasons, one of which is I work with faculty a lot. I oftentimes encounter courses where faculty don't have any kind of a navigation, whether it's a visual or a map or written directions. So students really know what's under every button. They just come into sort of what feels like a maze. This is also true of the institution itself. So they instituted a new way they needed faculty to report their activities, and human resources put them into a system they've never touched, and then emailed a 65-slide deck for them to wade through to figure it out. So I had a number of people that I had to work with, and then I just had my team create a step-by-step that was much simpler. So that was very hostile to me. So.
And I think the learning curve of technologies, like we have this assumption that we're in a digital age, people are digitally literate. I think that's actually a really interesting example, Meg, of hostile architecture, where we create systems that are so complex that only some users are able to use it. So that's a great example, and not one that I've used before. So thank you.
Sure.
Okay. So I had a lot more interactivity. I am aware of our time though, so I'm just going to go through a couple more slides about some of the concepts. If there's interest in continuing the conversation into a part 3, I'm happy to try and facilitate something like that, because I know we wanted to talk about sort of some of the counter approaches to architectures of control, which I think we're not going to be able to do sufficiently in the next 7 minutes. So please just let me know in the chat or DM or whatever if you're interested in having a third part of this. But a couple of the things that I did just want to address more broadly was the differences in design. So I'm showing you here that picture that I showed you before of the green boulevard with the no camping sign full of boulders. And why this picture is really helpful is because we understand different ways of setting expectations in a space. So the sign sets a rule, and the sign, if it existed by itself, would be a mechanism of trust, saying this is the rule for this space. I trust you as students to not camp here. I trust you to not engage in this behavior because this isn't the place to do that. The hostile architecture, the sign is not hostile architecture. The hostile architecture is the boulder saying, I don't trust you to follow the rules. I don't trust that you're going to do the thing that I tell you not to do here. So I'm going to make it impossible for you to do that thing. And so they sort of are, they sort of have the same intention, which is to prevent camping in this space, but they function very differently and they form a very different relationship with the potential users of that space. This is not an example of a digital space. So I do now have an example of a digital space where we can see the same sort of mechanisms of control or mechanisms of mutual expectations. So this is a picture from my learning management system at my institution, and it's from the assignments page where you set up an assignment. And on it, you can set up the availability of the assignment. So it allows you to set the open date, which is the first time students are able to submit an assignment, the due date, which sits in the system as telling students it's due by this date. And if students submit past that due date, their assignments will be marked as late. But the due date does not prevent students from submitting past this date. And then an accept until date. And the accept until date, whatever that date is, once it's passed, students will be unable to actually submit the assignment. So here we see, similar to the boulevard, the due date is like the rule. It's like the sign saying, please submit by this date. I trust that you'll do that. But if there are circumstances that make that impossible, the system will continue to allow you to submit. The accept until date is the hostile architecture, and that it says, okay, the system's going to lock down past this date. You cannot submit. No more submissions. I don't care. The system doesn't care why. So if you experienced something detrimental in your life that made it so you couldn't connect, if your internet went out, if you had a power outage, doesn't care, you cannot submit past that date. So again, it sort of shows the two different mechanisms of setting expectations of behavior versus controlling behavior. And I am going to pause there because the rest of the slides, I think if we are going to do a third part, would be helpful to talk about that. The slides are there if you want to look forward on the slides, and there is a references page on slide 31 that talks about some of this. But the next conversation would be sort of looking at who's impacted by these mechanisms of control, and then opening up the conversation, countering my initial point where I said I'm very critical. So my stance is control mechanisms bad. But actually opening up space for conversations where control mechanisms might be appropriate and how they might help certain people in certain spaces. But I will pause and leave it there. And maybe actually read some of the comments in the chat, or if anyone else wants to jump in and say anything at this point. Bridget asks, is it ever appropriate to not trust? I'm thinking of the intentionally equitable hospitality. How would we prevent bad actors from hurting others by violating the rules? I think I'm actually going to take a screenshot of that question, Bridget, because I think if we do continue the conversation to talk about this, that's actually a great starting off point. I hope you don't mind that I'm stealing your question.
Sure, please. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to defend the word hostile, but I think there could be a good side, or maybe if we think of it as boundaries that make it, I guess another thing I was thinking is the theme is to make it easier to do one kind of behavior than another in a certain space. And we as teachers certainly all want to make it easier to do, to reduce barriers for students to do some kinds of behavior, and to make it harder or less appealing for them to do other kinds of behavior. So that seems a little bit inevitable. And then, so how do we see it as either hostile or enabling?
And slide 27 sort of was where that conversation happened. Is control always hostile? So we talked about, throughout this, I've talked about hostile design and architectures of control as synonymous. But then our final conversation, which hopefully will now be part 3, is, are they always? Are architectures of control always hostile? And I think that's a great question. And for those of you who are interested, I'm a cyclist, and my images here show a bike lane in New York that is completely obstructed by a moving van and the cyclist can't get by, versus a protected bike lane in Ottawa. So some seeds for future conversation.
Just like the accept until date, in my case, our university, you can tell we're very rule bound. We are only allowed to give an incomplete under certain circumstance. And when we give that incomplete, we have to justify why we gave the incomplete. So that accept until is almost something that is, in order for me to give my students their final grades, which some of them have to have their final grades by a certain time, I've got to have that accept until date, because otherwise the student who would have the incomplete, I can put in an incomplete, but they are not allowed to submit any new work past a certain time. They can submit something, but when it comes to the actual final product, any new work, there's a date on that. And that's out of my control. So therefore, I have to put that in there, not only for myself, but for the student to know, we need a conversation if you need this, or you need to do some paperwork, because I have to have it in by this certain date.
So what I love about what you've just said, Virginia, and I realize that we're at half the hour. So before I respond, I'm just going to say thank you for those who came and joined us. And if you need to leave, please do. But what you've just kind of expressed is the connection between hostile architectures and the hidden curriculum, because your institution has policies that are forcing you to use architectures of control on your students in order to meet those policies. So it's actually that interesting, like, full circle of how all those pieces are interconnected. So I find that really, really interesting. And Bridget asked in the chat, did you have to select the reason from a drop-down menu? I'm assuming that's the reason why a student got an incomplete.
And if that is, then no. We have to, what it is we can give them an incomplete, but then there is a form that we have to fill out through our department. So it's not even computerized. It's like we have to get something from our department chair that allows us to give the incomplete. So it's a very, very top down, we're out of our hands type of thing. It's not hard to do it, but there's that extra piece that if you aren't hitting the deadlines from the system, then you can't, once you get past that, you can't, it's much more difficult to give the incomplete, in other words. So up until a certain point, I can give you an incomplete, but I have to know by that point what's happening.
Yeah, also, I was thinking of what reasons are considered legitimate or illegitimate reasons for an incomplete. Even the same thing phrased differently, like maybe stress would not be acceptable, but anxiety would be, or family problems are in one case and not another, a doctor's note, who can write that, those kind of things on, but it sounds like your university has some flexibility, it gives you some amount of discretion, so that's good.
Right, it's more of I can do it up to a certain point, and after that point, once I've handed in my grades, I can't do it, because then after I've handed in my grades, then I'm asking for new post grades. You can't hand in any new assignments. So if it's an incomplete, when I hand in my grades, you're given a certain amount of time that you can finish up. If you hand in your grades and you don't give someone an incomplete because they didn't, once I hand in those grades, unless we've decided, and that's the other thing, is they made the incomplete has to be generated from the student, not from the instructor. That was the piece that I was missing, sorry. So I can't say to the student, are you going to hand this in? If you can't ask, I can say, informally, you need to ask me for an incomplete if you want an incomplete. But once you have to ask me by a certain point, because otherwise I am required to give you a grade based on the work that you've given me up until that point, unless you've asked me for an incomplete. So it was something that I really didn't like. It was a policy that we were fighting against, but the administration got through. And there's so many things that happen from that because someone may not be in a position to ask for an incomplete because they're in a hospital, for example. So, but that's why that date, I have to put, I like to use that because then students know, oh, I have to ask by that date if I want it incomplete.
And thank you guys so much, by the way, for the session. It's been great.
Oh, yes, it's been
Everyone who
wonderful.
contributed.
I think we need a part 3. As you've seen, everybody has said we need a part 3. So I hope you can prepare for that and we'll all be happy to join. I'm just going to stop the recording for the sake of just but I think we can stay for a few more minutes for those who want to stay, and then we can just call it. So thank you, Danny, for a wonderful session. And we are looking forward to a part 3. And from my side, it's good evening because it's already 9:30 in Kenya. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, but I'm just stopping the recording.